Well, I'm told I was born in Midtown Manhattan in some hospital long since gone in the early 60s of the street numbers. And we lived 14 years or so on Lexington Avenue and 67th Street. And my father had been married once, and with his wife and a child who was being born, died in the flu epidemic of 1918, I guess, when a lot of people were struck. But he had a previous son, and so he was anxious, I guess, to remarry somebody to take care of my older brother, who was somewhat of a care. He was full of energy. So he was quite a gifted, and he always wanted to be a lawyer. So he came out of a fairly conservative Irish Catholic household. His father used to get the boys up very early in the morning, contrary to their wishes. And my father had a chance to go to Harvard Law, so he graduated from Mount St. Mary's in, I guess, Emmitsburg, and went to Harvard, where he graduated from college at 20, and then he finished his courses, and then he went to Harvard Divinity, where I think he had two roommates who later became fairly noted. One was Joseph Kennedy. And so the story goes, reported by my brother, who was somewhat of interested in our ancestry. Nobody else was. So, but he was a great storyteller, so we can't be certain of all the details. But it seems that Mr. Kennedy was dating Rose at the time, who was the daughter of Honey Fitz, the mayor of Boston. So it seems that they were out on the town and innocently got into some kind of brawl and were taken to jail, which means they would have been, at that time, immediately expelled from Harvard Law School. They didn't allow such cavorts to that extent. So they, desperate to get out of jail before the authorities at the school knew about it, so they called up Rose in the middle of the night and said, "We've got to get us out of here." And she, I guess, was able to intercede with her father, and they escaped that. And then my father tried to get a job in New York, and he didn't succeed too well, but he took an interest in maritime law, so he went to the most noted firm there, which was, I forget what it was called then, and later became known as Curlin Campbell Keating, his name, and McGran, and Judge Woolsey, I think, was a member of that firm. He became a judge in the New York court system. And so when my grandfather, who was the head of this firm, Mr. Curlin, and not Catholic, saw his record, he said, "Mr. Keating, you have very fine marks and you'd be qualified to join our firm, but we don't take Roman Catholics around here. So, sorry, here are your papers." So my father is very resourceful, said, "Well, don't you have any Catholic clients?" And Mr. Curlin said, "Well, now that you mention it, yes, we have the Grace steamship lines, we represent them." So the result was that he got the job, and then he was so good that my grandfather started talking about him when he got home at night, and his daughter said, well, he's such a nice man, why don't you bring him down? I would like to meet him. And so he visited their house on Long Island in, I think, Locust Valley. And sure enough, they began to fall in love, and they married. And she took on this, my older brother, which was no small act of adventure. And then my sister came along, and then I did, and then a third brother. So she was not, she read scripture, but she was not she was non-aligned, as you might say, but had great esteem for the New Testament. And my father, at this point, decided that he would leave the practicing on the basis that he had been to so many masses that were required when he was a student at St. Mary's that felt he had filled his quota for the rest of his life, and so he needed to exercise on Sunday, so he didn't come to church either. So we had no real intense, I don't think we even said grace at meals. So. But my mother, faithful to her agreement at the time of marriage, with saw that we got instructed but we went to all private schools, and I went to Buckley School in New York and 74th Street, so it was in range even of small legs, and I could walk there. And when the children got to be a certain age, they moved to Long Island. My mother never liked living in New York, so they got a house there. So from there I went to a boarding school called Deerfield Academy. And I found that extremely confining at the time. And so I managed to skip out of one of the classes. So I came into Yale at only 17 or so. And then when the war came on, it accelerated even more, and I had other engagements after being there 2 years, so I went back to New York, or home really, to await being drafted. I didn't feel I wanted to. I didn't know whether this was a just war yet. There was a lot of confusion. And it was in the early 40s, and there wasn't too much news of the Holocaust and those other horrors. So I thought, well, if I'm drafted, I'll go, but I'm not going to sign up, because that would be a choice. And I, in principle, am not in favor of war. In fact, I was, pretty close to being a pacifist. And some of my friends actually went to jail for refusing to sign up for the draft. I didn't think I could go quite that far. So my first year at Yale, I experienced a significant crisis of faith. And I thought of whether I would continue to practice the Roman Catholic practices of Mass and the other important rituals. So I read this book by Tolstoy because I was in a class of contemporary philosophers, and he was rated as one. He has a book on the Sermon on the Mount that sort of attacks the bourgeois observance of Christianity that has a lot to be said against it. So, and I decided to continue my practice and to study the history of the church, and in doing so, I began to discover the contemplative writers and the mystics. There is a very, very rich tradition of mystical teachings of various kinds. And I happened to find in the Yale library this book by Thomas Aquinas had put together of the sayings of the fathers of the church about the four gospels line by line. And so each line had about 7 different commentaries in. And the bottom line of that was fascinating for me because I could see that the Christianity was, at least as understood in those early centuries, was about the contemplative dimension of the gospel and of life, and that this is what I wanted to do with my life, to pursue that. So that book, which I don't think had ever been, the pages hadn't been slit yet, I doubt if anybody ever read it after me, but it just happened to be there. I thought I was getting, a volume of the famous series he wrote, Summa Theologica. But it was scripture, and it was the kind of spontaneous commentaries that in other traditions you would call it a Dharma talk or something like that.
Tell me about this time at Yale and this crisis of faith. What was going on for you?
Well, it was a question of whether I would want to continue the practice of it and the devotional practice I had, such as saying the rosary that I had picked up from my brother. He was sent to all Catholic schools because my father's first wife had been very devout, and he knew that's what she would have wanted.
Was there some particular, do you remember, was there some particular event? Had you met somebody? Was there something you remember being said where you're like, were you?
Well, it was in reading the contemporary philosophies who, were certainly not very religious. They were either from the Enlightenment or the far end of it, and so they had a negative view of religion in general, and perhaps especially Christianity, especially those Europeans at that time. Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and I can't remember all their names, but I was more interested in trying to refute some of the things that they said. The book, as I said, that really impressed me was this commentary of Tolstoy on the Four Gospels, which questions the institutional aspect of Christian churches as they existed in his day. Perhaps you're aware that he had a great estate in the old Tsarist regime, and he gave, I think then he used to give, after his conversion to Christianity, he gave up a lot of his wealth, and he started working with the serfs on the estate. And he also was a friend of Gandhi. He was noted for his nonviolent sympathies with him towards the end of his life.
Do you remember any part of? You said the book was on the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
Was there a particular part that you remember as the most deeply resonating?
Yes, the necessity of being poor if you wanted to be a good Christian. That impressed me since I came from a fairly well-to-do household or family. Father finally achieved the dream of his life was a significantly large house in Long Island overlooking Oyster Bay. Looking east, the Yankee Clipper used to fly over our house when that started going years ago. But I never actually heard him argue a case except once. So his life as a lawyer was something that took place outside the realm of our experience. He was very good, I gathered, because he argued many times before the Supreme Court and was involved in representing the underwriters in all the great shipwrecks of, like the Morro Castle case and things like that. So his dream was that I would take his place, of course, and that was the last thing I wanted to do. And it especially became evident as I began to commit myself completely to the studying the history. And I studied it so well that I almost got flunked out of Yale, because though I had graduated fairly high in the class, I lost all interest in nothing at Yale interested me at all, except Catholic Church that was there and the opportunities I had to, to study. So I really, I didn't have anybody to direct me, and in those days, not many people were familiar with the tradition. I couldn't find anything from other people about it. So I committed myself more and more and began to pray a lot or meditate a lot, and I read the Christian mystics. So for 2 years I gave myself a course in the Christian mystical tradition. And that led me to want to find a way of life in which I could permanently pursue this with the maximum hope of good results. And in those days, it was thought that the best place to pursue a life of serious prayer and meditation was in a cloister. So I looked around for the second thing that was considered useful, which was a hard life, very strict, and separated from the world. So I found the Trappists, and I think I succeeded in finding one. It was pretty tough, because after I finally entered at the age of 20, I had to wait to be almost 21 because my parents were totally against it. And it was a choice of values that were the direct opposite of those that my poor father had, and so he was really emotionally shaken up by my choice. And so in those days, I wasn't too concerned in what they felt, because I felt I had to follow what I felt was my vocation, and if they didn't like it, that was their problem. So there was a certain amount of selfishness involved in my thinking. Later, I began to sympathize more with what they went through, it was a hard enough decision for me with my own dependencies on people and various things that make life pleasant. So I really radically gave up everything I had and committed myself to that life in January of 1944, which was in the middle of the war then, and rationing, and it was a pretty austere life. He used to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning for vigils in a cold church, because you couldn't afford the oil well in those days. And it was a very strict silence, so you couldn't share your experiences with your peers. You could only talk to 2 people, basically, the novice master and the abbot. Not the best choices for friends, since they could throw you out at any time. But they were very wonderful people, and they guided me according to that tradition, which in those days was strong on the penitential side. So the fasting was significant, although it had been mitigated by the Holy See, because people didn't have the kind of constitutions they had in earlier periods of human history, and a lot of people were just dying as a result of the austerities, especially in women's convents that had a comparable state of life. So in the early first 10 years of my life there, the order was beginning to recover its original inspiration in the 11th century of trying to recover the spirit and methods of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, which was a movement of monasticism, lay monasticism in the third and fourth century. They inhabited the deserts of Egypt and Palestine and Syria, among other places. And when that teaching was crystallized in the conferences of Cashin, who was a Western aspirant to monastic life, who went there and, like you're doing, interviewed all these people who allegedly were somewhat knowledgeable in this area. He brought it back and started a monastery in Marseille, which led to a monastic spring, or at least resurgence, in that part of Europe. And after about 200 years of experiments that didn't survive, the rule of Saint Benedict came into focus, which is a very significant cultural factor in Europe. It persevered and became the one rule for Western monks. And there was a lot of them, and then they humanized the areas in which they lived. They had hospitality. They sometimes took in travelers. They sometimes taught the peasants around them how to farm and so on. And some of them turned into cities eventually. And some of them, to survive themselves, got into business projects that led to the need of establishing a group of lay brothers who didn't do the primary work, which was chanting the office and doing Lectio Divina in private, but who served the needs of the community so that the choir monks, as they were called, could devote themselves full time to spiritual practice. So it was a life of prayer that didn't normally have an external ministry except the guest house and so on. So that's the life that I bought into under the influence of the popular ideas of the time, that to be a contemplative, you would normally do so inside of a contemplative structural lifestyle. And that the harder the life, the more likely you were to succeed in this project. It took me about 25 years to outgrow that idea, and partially the experience of meeting with other deeply meditative traditions helped me to broaden my perspective and to have confidence in my own insights that all of the rituals are designed to go in this direction, and that it's meant for people living in the world, and perhaps they need it more than those who have the privilege of a structure that supports them day and night in this project.
Let me ask you, I'm going to weave in a few questions as we continue. I'm really interested I want to go back to the idea of poverty.
Yes.
And it only struck me as you were telling the story just how different that was than your father's value.
Opposite.
So tell me more about that, the reading about the lines about poverty and what poverty meant to you. Like what was the resonance?
Well, I wanted to follow Christ, and I had good experiences with the early, rites of transition, you'd call them, rites of passage, like First Communion and Confirmation, that have comparable events in other traditions. But it was reading Tolstoy. He's a very powerful writer. Idea of poverty, that I could see that so much of the way people lived the Christian life was sheer compromise and watered down certainly the literal meaning of the wisdom sayings of Jesus. So so there was an element of affective devotion or love for the ideal or the example and the generosity that I saw in my reading of the gospel and what little I did of other books. People didn't read spiritual books in those days the way they do today. Spirituality was there, but not talked up as a rule in the, in the homilies or Sunday preaching and so on. More on the strictly moral level, whereas I could see that the Christianity was, at least in its full sense, was about keeping the first two commandments and pushing them even further. And it was like falling in love with God, and that anything less was more or less, it seemed to me, rather second-rate. Probably I was a little stuffy and triumphalistic in my own insights in those days. So
the idea of poverty.
I was judgmental, yeah. But poverty, I meant what Tolstoy is talking about is concrete poverty, living with the poor and being poor, too. That was the message. So I was so strongly moved by that I thought, no, maybe I should leave the household and take some lowly apartment in Harlem where I was working with, later, I guess it was a little later than I taught catechism in Spanish Harlem there. But I tried to, let go of all the luxuries or amenities of the life that the rest of the family were living. So I was trying to be a Trappist in the midst of a fairly elegant house on Long Island in one of the most expensive real estate centers on earth, I guess, in those days. People used to build mansions on the Hudson. They moved down to Long Island after World War I believe. They since moved again, as you must be aware. So, but when I announced that at home, there was a certain amount of consternation, and my mother convinced me to get some advice from a priest friend of the family who had taught my younger brother catechism, and at whose summer camp for underprivileged children I had agreed to work. I did that for 2 summers while I was at Yale. But the teaching about humility and taking the lowest place and giving up one's relatives and family and property and ownership and non-possessive attitude, freely accepted for the sake of the kingdom, as Jesus called it. All of that was earth-shattering for the family. The younger ones had their, they were involved in their own projects, so it didn't hit them so hard. But it meant that all that my father had hoped, or the money put into my education, which he, made a special effort to find the very best schools, something that's fairly typical, I guess, now.
Did you ever?
It was lost. I was a total loss, and it was obvious that I was not sympathetic with the professional life or the legal profession. So,
did you ever connect with your father on that before he passed away? Or?
No, no. He thought I had just sort of died, entered a tomb, and I must say there was some reason to think that way in those days. It was. I never expected to leave the property, or even you weren't allowed to come home for a visit, even sickness or death in the family in those days. It's since been somewhat humanized since Second Vatican Council, but in those days.
You were really cloistered.
Yes, totally. So as I started to say about the first 5 or 10 years, I only spoke to, I guess, more or less 6 years, apart from work, a few directions at work, to 2 people. And they were, I never knew the last name of the other people in the novitiate. So silence was very strict, and there was a sign language for what was necessary, but you were always at the chapter of faults. You have to accuse yourself of making too many useless signs, which was, so the emphasis on silence was almost absolute. It was so absolute that when we finally had a fire, 6 years after I was in there, and we were, some of us was living, sleeping in a dormitory, on top of a fire trap, with the guest house on the first floor where the fire started, so the smoke was coming up in the middle of the night, and no one said anything because it was against the rule. And second, you'd think somebody would have thought that this might be a reason to make an exception. But the habits that you form, especially when you wake up in the middle of the night, tend to apparently go off. So I didn't say anything either. One person said, a very low voice, "Get up, everybody, there's a fire in the guest house." But by that time it was pretty clear there was a fire somewhere, because the dormitory was filling with this black, choking smoke. So we barely got out of there alive. We had to go down the stairs into the fire, where it was, but someone alert, one of the brothers who was alert, who had gotten out earlier and was in the side parts of the fire, and called out to us to come in that direction, because it was absolutely blacked out. If he hadn't done that, we would certainly have been consumed in those flames. But that caused an enormous change in our life, because we had no place to go. And so the community itself went to an abandoned CCC camp from the Roosevelt era that the governor of Rhode Island offered us, because it was, and it had floors that went like this, and pot-bellied stove, and these 12 of the brothers who were there for almost a year came up with TB. It was quite a tough time for the community. Meanwhile, we started to move to another location in Massachusetts that is called St. Joseph's Abbey. And but before the last year, we were at this monastery in Rhode Island. I was ordained and completed theological studies that were really rather second-rate, because they weren't trained in how to teach it. Since then, the Vatican has insisted on having degrees, even if you're in a cloister, with the exception, I guess, of the Carthusians, who are also another contemplative order.
One of the questions I like to ask people is, what's your earliest memory of God and of faith as you think back in your life?
Well, my memory is not too good anymore. I'm 85 and a half, and so perhaps it was, we had a nurse who was a Irish Roman Catholic from Boston, and she used to speak about her experience of the Catholic Church and so on. And there was, my father wasn't actively against the church so much as just wanted to sort of leave it behind. And so she may have said some things that we picked up in the course of, conversing about so many things. But she was in our household for a long time because of, she took care of my sister and I, and then my brother came 7 years later, and she was his nurse for first 8 or so years, or 10 of his life.
Do you remember?
So she was a strong Catholic influence.
Do you remember anything that she said that resonates?
No, I don't.
You just remember her as a presence?
Yes, and she's the one who took us to Mass. My parents didn't go. So, and she had a special affection for me, I guess, because I was rather a frail health as a child, and I'm sure she nursed me back to health in 2 diseases, both involving gland trouble of some kind, that I came close to dying from. And since she really took care of me, I had great affection for her. And so she must have influenced me a lot in those very formative years. In fact, she was kind of a protection against the rather strong anger that my father had sometimes, and he used to have to spank my older brother, so I was probably terrified of those stories. So she kind of protected or concealed my faults because she tended to dote on me, and I think she had the idea that maybe I would be a priest because I was somewhat devout. Because the idea that any time you show any sense of devotion or prayer, you should become this or that is a very institutional view of a vocation, I think. That's a factor, but the real factor is, what your really deepest desire or attraction is.
Do you remember the first time in your life that or the earliest memory you have about your own questions about God, or your own thoughts about God?
Well, I didn't have any questioning until that experience when I was at this philosophical course in Yale and ran into Tolstoy. But it didn't concern God. That was not an issue. It concerned the particular practices of the Roman Catholic communion at that time, which I felt, I didn't know much about the Protestant communions, I felt was not manifesting the purity of the gospel teaching. That's what I wanted to do. And of course that was interpreted by my advisors. The friend priest that I mentioned earlier of my parents he naturally thought, I understand you have a vocation to religious life. That was his interpretation of my story that I've just told you about wanting to leave home. And it wouldn't have been too practical, for one thing. I would just have been drafted. And I didn't have, I don't know that living in an apartment would have been the kind of poverty I had in mind, but I did want to be, felt that to live with or close to those who actually were poor was part of the equation.
So tell me, what would you say was the experience in your life where you took on your faith? Where you feel like you embraced your faith?
Well, it was shortly after that questioning period when I started reading the history of the church, and my questions at that time at least were thoroughly answered, and I discovered the rich, inspiring traditions and experiences of the early fathers of the church, and then I read in the course of a year or so, many of the other mystics. And I began, going to church a lot. I used to go over there twice a day. Besides daily mass, I'd hang out at the novenas with the old ladies who used to circulate the side altars. And so I was ready to do anything to make headway in this. And my poor roommate was very perplexed. What I was doing, he didn't really have any religion at all, I don't think. He was a very nice guy. We got on well, but we were in two different worlds. I might as well have been someplace else than at Yale. It just provided me with the shelter. And of course, my father was paying for that and expected me to, not to drop out, because I was, instead of reading, doing my homework, I was studying the mystics a lot. So much so that my former headmaster came down and asked me what was happening. I think he was worried about me. He was very kind to me in helping me get into Yale, although I was, left his school a year early. But he had the wisdom to see that I had to do that. He wanted me so much to stay another year. He even said, you'll probably be president of the class if you stay. Well, that meant nothing to me. I was so eager to get out of there. It was too confining in those days for my New York upbringing, I guess.
So tell me...
But what he was a well-known headmaster, and what he was able to do, which not everybody who's professional is able to do, is to do what is best for the person involved. And he saw that it would be worse for me if I stayed in that disposition than if he let me go. He didn't approve in any way. It wasn't as if I convinced him that I was right, but he adjusted his own hopes and expectations as a professional headmaster to my needs. I didn't know that at the time. And I was very surprised that he let me out, because he was a very dominant figure in the school. But later on, I came to greatly esteem what he, I guess you'd call it the sacrifice he made. I was just one student, of course, but I'm sure he did the same for many other students in different ways. So I just continued growing, and I had the experience of being a counselor at this Dominican camp on the Hudson. That brought me into very close contact with people who came from very poor backgrounds in the Bronx and parts of New York. And I was living in the usual camping facilities, which I'd never done before. And it was all brand new to me and stretching, and it was really not my cup of tea, because I wanted to keep studying and have plenty of time for prayer, which was not available during the camping season. It was really going through a novitiate there, and so I was better prepared than the ordinary vocation, I think, to enter the monastery, and prepared for the penitential life that was not only offered but expected and imposed, if you wanted to stay at least. So I also, once I was in the monastery, tried to spend as much, if not all, my free time in the church praying, because my understanding was that this is how you grow in the contemplative dimension of the gospel. But I did all the things you were supposed to do, and there were plenty of them, and the work was quite hard at times, and the food very sparse. So I'm surprised that I got through it, actually. But the abbot was very considerate of me and very a little ahead of his time, and a contributor to some of the reforms that took place after the Second Vatican Council in religious life and in our particular branch of it. You asked me if there was ever any reconciliation, I guess I could use that word, between my father and I about our diverse attitudes. Well, there actually was, but it wasn't. It took about 15 years for the thaw to begin, and it was a great blessing, because in the Jewish tradition, the blessing of the father is very significant, as you know, Abraham's blessing and Isaac's blessing, and of their sons. Isaac's, I guess, the 12 tribes each received a blessing. Well, and so, if they say in that, those who've studied that aspect of anthropological cultural descent, say that if you don't have the blessing of your father, something is always missing. So I think that's a part of an archetype that may have gone out of recent parenting, but I think it's still strong in some traditions, like perhaps the Jewish. I don't know it well enough. But in the old days, even in Europe, the father decided what your profession would be. And in Ireland, the oldest son only inherited the land, and then the second son would be encouraged to be a cleric or a priest. So it was very structured societal things that worked its way into people's psyche, so that it was expected. And if you didn't do it, you were sort of an outcast or a problem in the family. So my father must have inherited a little bit of that. And you still see it, you know. When it comes to inheritance, the children are always the first thought, not non-profit organizations. So what happened was that the abbot evidently saw in me, you know, material for his projects of the growth of the order, which greatly expanded after the Second World War. And so he sent me to be help to found this place as a new monastery take care of the growing numbers of young people entering the order after World War II and later. That since slowed down a lot. So when he sent me out here as a kind of appointed superior to help found the place, this without my doing anything, because I felt helpless to try to, to reach my father in any way, because I knew he thought I stood for everything he had rejected. And as well as being a disappointment to the very real investment he put in me based on his ideas of giving all the children the best of everything. But when I became a superior, something changed for him. He began to think, well, maybe my son is worth something after all. I don't know that he thought of this explicitly, but he began to soften, and that enabled me to feel more at ease in talking to him and in appreciating, the particular difficulties he was going through. And the shipping business went through a decline in New York after airplanes came into. So we became more friends, and I was allowed to stop home on my way to and fro on the business of the order. And little by little, he took a great interest in this place. And when we were hard up for funds to finish the building project, and I went home briefly to see if I could raise funds rather than have to go back there, and then the abbot would temporarily close the place because they were making foundations in South America at this point that called on the funds of our chief benefactors. But when I went back there and told him about it, he said, well, this has been a good year for me. I'll give you some money. And when he suggested I meet some other people and they didn't come through, he gave me twice as much. So here he was contributing to the last thing on earth that he would ever have chosen on his own. So, and this, he was even disappointed when I became abbot of Spencer, which I suppose you could look upon as a, what do you call those things, a promotion. But he took a great interest in this place, and if it wasn't for those funds, we might not be here now, because the benefactor that my abbot at the time was counting on got cancer and died suddenly, and her will that established a foundation was battled by 120 relatives or something, so that we never received any more funding from that source. But for me, that was a very deep experience of how what I call God it works in my life. In other words, I don't have to do anything. I prayed for him, but I was powerless, and it was in that it takes time, years, that I perceived how God was arranging events outside of both of us that would bring us to some degree of reconciliation. And so my conviction is that the ultimate reality is that which is beyond any concept to name, is a presence and an energy, or it could be both personal and impersonal. Those are just terms that have specific meanings, I guess, in some cultures or theologies. But it's a living presence, incredible intelligence, caring, and concern. And secretly doesn't need anything, so it doesn't need applause or praise or even thanks. Those are what we need in order to express our human reactions. But I think it's working in every human being to the nth degree. And it involves a kind of divine therapy that goes to the very roots of our human wounds, of which everybody is subject in early childhood, along with all the psychological and developmental struggles of trying to grow up with a great desire for happiness, but not knowing where it is, mistaking gratification of instinctual needs for happiness. I can see it doesn't work. I mean, it didn't work in me, and I haven't met anybody that it has worked for. So that's why I wanted to take the experience of the Christianity as a contemplative religion that is aimed at transformation, not just becoming a better person, however desirable that may be for our friends and relatives, but to really be changed into the divine in some way. That's just a word, but it means to move to, transpersonal psychology would call it a higher state of consciousness. So it seems to me that the whole of the human family is evolving very slowly and out of the consciousness of beasts and vegetables and non-conscious matter, if there is such a thing, into that from which it came, its source but all terms can't describe the source of being, which is both being and beyond being. So the higher teachings of the spiritual traditions in all the world religions seem to be aware of this dimension, but they express it differently with different terms. But I've met wonderful people from the other traditions who I've learned from. But it has only strengthened my initial encounter with the gospel in that book at Yale. So I think out of that little seed, the whole of my life has unfolded step by step and has deepened and extended to a broader vision that includes all creation. Like it seems to me to see all creation as the body of God is one image that can be helped. Or perhaps to add the feminine dimension, all creation is in the womb of God, growing up ever so slowly from very primitive forms into the ultimate maturity of human life and rational life, and through the dying process, this is the birth canal into eternal life. And that, of course, reflects the Christian view of eternal life and its permanency. So that vision, it continues to attract me with great force, but without the agitation, anxiety, and perhaps over-enthusiasm and defensiveness that were present in my early life and perhaps made it hard for my family to understand what I was doing. I just know what I was doing. I just stumbled along and was dragged along. But it was very clear to me that this is the path that I was supposed to go in. And I've had doubts about it along the way, but I regarded them as temptations and so on. But what then later happened was, after I resigned as the abbot of Spencer, which was a large monastery, and came here just as an ordinary one of the monks, a whole new vocation opened up of bringing the Christian contemplative life to lay persons or people in active ministries, social work, and so, whom I saw very clearly needed it more than we did to survive the new challenges of burnout and stress because of the difficult ministries of our time: psychology, counseling, social work, working with the poor, starving, all kinds of health care. I don't think you can do this without inner resources, at least for a long period of time. So it's love of God, which I'm committed to as the vision of all the Abrahamic religions. Love the Lord your God with your whole mind, heart, soul, and strength. That's the vision. Nobody does it. And many are trying, but we just haven't evolved to that capacity yet. When we do, life on earth will be very different. Because the mission statement is to love each other, love others as you love yourself. So this is all we have to do in whatever form, and there are myriad of forms of ways of doing it. But right now, a lot of people seem to be hell-bent in the opposite direction. But that is not depressing, however horrendous it is. Somehow, through the mistakes, faults, even the sins of people, the power of divine love is triumphing over sin itself and making it into unconditional love. And some people, and those people hopefully will begin to influence society at the deepest levels, perhaps, but with appropriate action and creativity to ease the endless and often needless suffering of people in the third world. So I can't understand how governments can build more and more and invest more and more billions in a defense that is self-destructive and is almost certain to destroy them if anybody starts using nuclear weapons or biological or chemical. So we've evolved to this marvelous operational logic that can produce all this equipment, but the spirit or the heart of people hasn't kept pace with that, so that their horizontal information is not moderated by a vertical dimension of values and that takes the life and death at their face value. So I don't want to anticipate any of your questions, but
do you feel like you can recall, and by the way, as you were talking about, all of creation is the body of God looking out the window.
Well, God is just a label. There's many names for it. I don't think he minds what you call him.
It's actually, I'll tell my stories later. It's about you.
All right.
No, I'll tell you real quickly. I interviewed 3 people recently that none of them wanted to use the word God.
It's a difficult word in interreligious dialogue. I try to avoid it. Usually we settled on, in my conversations with a group that meets here every year of interfaith people, I call it the ultimate reality. I'd have preferred to call it the ultimate mystery, but that's because mystery has a specifically Christian meaning to me that the others don't have.
Yeah. So
it's not the words that are so important, it's the experience. Is it similar? Is it the same?
Yeah,
is it graded? All of these questions can only be answered by those who were not only devoted or have read about it, but who are into the experience in a significant degree.
One of the things I love about 12 Steps is God as you understand. Higher power.
Yes. Sure, that's a perfectly good term. But notice the 11th step is about prayer and meditation. I'd like to see that moved up to one of the earlier steps because I think it would help the process. But at the time, Bill W. and the others didn't have any, there wasn't a specific method. When our friends from the East came with their methods, they introduced that dimension. That I think
I'm working on right now. I mean, I've been in steps many times, and I've sponsored many people, but me personally, I'm focused on the meditation part of the 11th step and trying to understand what that is for me. Right.
Well, what, if I may say so, what is useful is having a specific method. And there are many of them, and each of the traditions has a number of them, that moves towards cultivating interior silence or detaches us from our overdependence on concepts to go to this. God is not a concept. He's or she is a happening. And it's always happening. And our human intellect just can't wrap itself around that reality. So it needs the development of our intuitive capacities, which we have, but don't know how to use yet. The method can greatly further that project. So we have we offer centering prayer as an 11th step, and quite a few folks have started doing it. It's in fact a kind of granddaddy in AA who has lots of sponsees, and I have an interview together on the 12 steps as how it relates to the Christian scheme of things. Might come out sometime next year.
Oh, wonderful. Who is that?
His name, well, he's supposed to be anonymous, you know. He doesn't have his name on the book. I'm trying to tell him, make an exception, but he says no.
Don't say it. Well, that would be wonderful. My story. So the three people who wouldn't use the word God, the first one was this lovely, wonderful rabbi in Boulder, this young woman named Jamie Korngold, who goes by the Adventure Rabbi. Have you heard of her? Have you heard of this?
Well, I know quite a few rabbis over there, but I might have heard.
She calls herself the Adventure Rabbi, and her whole experience was about returning. She just published a book with Doubleday on finding God in the wilderness. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so for her,
good. Well, there's a lot of good things happen in Boulder, as you know.
Somebody said to me, 60 square miles of beautiful country surrounded by reality. But so she said, for her, God, that which is greater than us.
Yes. That's the essential. It must be greater than us, or higher power.
And then I'm very close with a couple in Cincinnati. She's a choreographer and movement therapist in her 70s, and her husband is a very famous Jewish composer, and he was the head of liturgy at Hebrew Union College for 30-something years. So a liturgical composer. And she said, for her, God, she didn't want to use that term, she said, that which cannot be named.
Well, that's very solid, traditional, and present in all the traditions, the spiritual traditions, at least, of the world religion. But it doesn't quite get down to folks in the pew or wherever they're sitting.
And he, even though he's a great liturgical composer, his name is Bon Yeshur, he said for him, he actually said he wasn't even sure he believed in God, but he feels listened to.
Mm-hmm.
He that listens to us.
Yes. Well, there's a delicate, razor-sharp distinction between atheists and those who are being purified of their own ideas of God in the dark nights, which are kind of ways of growing up and of perceiving that there's no concept, there's no name you can give to God, which is a fundamental idea, of course, in the Hebrew religion.
That we have it right.
You're not supposed to say it. If it has a name, you're not supposed to say it.
One of the questions I am interested in is, do you believe you can recall the first time in your life that you had to rely upon God, or that you chose to rely upon God?
But I do this all the time, so I can't think of a first time at this point that was really explicit. After all, I've spent most of my time trying to forget self, so memories are not high on my agenda at this point. Present moment doesn't think of the past or the future. So why make a project out of it? You can make an exception, like I'm doing now. But I don't really enjoy, it's like looking at somebody else's life. I don't identify with that part of my life anymore. I'm responsible, but I don't think or feel or perceive in those ways anymore, even when I was a fairly devout youngster. I used to, in fact, sometimes go to Mass before school, but since I knew it wouldn't be too well accepted, I used to hide the fact, slip out, because I'm pretty sure my father wouldn't have approved.
So say more to me, this is really important. the idea of even recollecting the things that we're talking about here
Yes.
is somehow in conflict with the idea of being present.
Yes, it isn't something you reject, but it's something that's part of the present moment if it has any value at all. And of course the fascinating thing is that everything is recorded. I mean, science says that every event we ever had in the bodily form is recorded in some neuron somewhere in the body. You can get a rerun at the time of death or something. So there's probably a database somewhere in the universe, because all human inventions must have some kind of counterpart in the ultimate or eternal reality that contains all things, or from which everything emerges. But all things that ever happened are present somewhere.
So, for you, what matters?
I beg your pardon?
What matters?
Nothing. When nothing, but that's based on a absolute confidence in God and His being really the higher power. So that's what matters. So if nothing matters, then everything matters. It's a paradox. But if some things matter to you, then it's not quite everything. And that's what separates us from the ultimate reality. In other words, God is so detached from being God that he'd just as soon not be. That's why he identifies so completely with the human condition, because it's a chance to be not God in a conscious way, at least in intelligence beings who are self-conscious and self-reflective. So to me, the humility of God, that is the acceptance of reality just as it is the kind of identification with what love means, or it's the foundation of love, or maybe the perfection of love is just to allow what happens to be, to let life live itself while trying, as a part of life, to heal its wounds in ourselves and in others.
What would you say you're most grateful for?
Oh, offhand, I'd say everything. But you asked most grateful, so that's a distinction I'd have to think about for a while. It would be, if I answered in the abstract, from a conceptual perspective, I guess I would say, well, God, or most grateful. But God is not an abstraction or a concept, so you really would need to answer by out of one's experience. And I guess what matters most to me is meditation. To be in union with God, whatever the psychological experience of the moment might be.
You kind of referred to it, but do you feel like you have a message that you would, people around the world will see your portrait, they see your picture all the time, but in this project they'll see your portrait, and what's your message that you would say?
Well, I think I have what is called a charism, which is not my message, but is some communication of the higher power that has been entrusted to me for some reason I know not, and which is simply a modest effort to contribute something to the recovery of the contemplative dimension of the gospel in Christianity, to recover it from my own particular a religious commitment, the Roman Catholic Church, but also to make it available to any other Christian denominations, since it belongs to them too as a tradition. It was present in the earliest church, and it has its roots in the Hebrew Bible in many places, are obviously describing a mystical experience of a higher power. And so I lost my train of thought. What was I?
You have a message.
Yes. So I don't have a message I want to impose on people, but simply an insight that through no merit of my own, and I just happen to have, and so I feel a responsibility to receiving it and to trying to pass it on with as much clarity as I'm capable of with the talents God has given me. But I don't see it as my message. It's my responsibility as a kind of channel of it to pass it on. But it's a sort of manifestation, at least in my view, of God's love, or is a way of trying to manifest in our time, or at least in those institutions I mentioned. And also to be able to dialogue with other world religions at that level of experience, so that we can move the religious history, consciousness of the whole of humanity a step closer to its destiny of becoming the divine way of being human, not just good human stuff, which is a great value, and we're far from it, I'm afraid, still. So I want to make God's love known in a way that is better than a lot of people seem to be perceiving it at the moment. Actually, when you see how little knowledge people have of the higher power, or how little influence it has in their conscious life, it makes me very sad, because the treasure that they have as part of their nature is this capacity for God that has virtually no limits and can bring them the freedom, peace, joy, bliss, capacity to serve, detachment. In other words, everything they want to be, in a sense they already are, but think they aren't, and madly are pursuing various things to fill up that void within them, which could so easily be filled with the divine, which is not in competition with anything human, but teaches us how to make it fully human, because it knows how we're made through and through, and can heal any wounds that we've contracted along the developmental process, or been imposed upon us from our cultural conditioning. So freedom is inner freedom, a great sign of the divine presence expanding. But love, of course, is the chief criteria, I think. And a love that is not self-centered, that is not seeking any reward, that thinks less and less of itself. That's why people ask me, well, why don't you write your life and so on? Everybody would like to hear about that. This doesn't make any impression on me at all, because I know it's all been God's gift, and I don't think you can write about your life accurately. Somebody else has to write it, and of course they don't know you anyway. So what's the point of rehashing things that you can't really communicate again in exactly the way they happened because you've forgotten many details. Or also, if you've been in conflicts, which I have, of course, in a long life, can you be fair to other people in describing what happened? Because their view of it is going to be, if they write a book, would be different. So I don't see how you can accurately, apart from certain specific incidents, a few we've talked about, that could be generalized and it could help people perhaps, or stimulate people to think of God's action in their own lives that might be useful. That I can see, but to give the whole panoramic view of one's birth to death, I wouldn't want to do it myself. And I don't think someone writing my life has the slightest idea of, what really makes me tick, because I don't even know myself. So it would be a work of futility, in my view, apart from certain specific incidents that, as I said, might have a special inspirational perspective. Especially as perspective that emphasizes how generous, how gratuitous, how completely self-giving, to the point of having no self, the higher power is. And how no host is comparable to the divine host. It gives us everything for free, planet and all the rest of it, air, light, all you need, friends, wonderful experiences, pleasures of all kinds. But it's the only host that can actually give himself, which is all of himself, in the degree that one can receive it with human limitations. So that I'd be willing to talk about. But so I return to your original question, at least in this part of our interview, it is meditation and in just being with God, in the silence of self,